the first groups of people that Dante meets are figures that don't really know what life's about. They're struggling, they're looking for leaders, they're looking for a kind of messiah, or alternative, they're looking for a kind of fear, because fear can give life shape and meaning. And we live in a time that's full of fears, and they may be grounded to some degree. I'm not denying there aren't real things to fear, but nonetheless, I think the reason why they dominate the narrative is because they seem to give a kind of negative form of meaning. Whereas in the purgatory, what's been learned is that fear actually contains the seeds of hope. And so whilst people in purgatory are suffering too, they know that this suffering is much more like the crises of developmental psychology, that if they can bear them, if they can hold them, stay with them, they're actually breakdowns that are leading to a breakthrough. And so in purgatory, there is the sense of expansion. It's not a closed data set, like the infernal state of mind.
Hi everyone, my name is Balázs Kégl. I'm the host of the iScientist podcast, where we explore artificial intelligence, science, and the scientists behind the science. So today is my great pleasure to host Mark Vernon. Mark is a philosopher, a writer, a theologian, and a psychotherapist. He even has a physics degree, right? So hi Mark, how are you today?
Hi there, hey, thanks very much for having me on. Nice to speak to you.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it for several reasons. One of them is that you are my first guest who is not coming from the narrow AI tech community. And so this marks a little bit my objective to open this podcast towards a bigger audience and towards a bigger point of view of discussing AI. So I read two of your recent books. One of them is The Secret History of Christianity, about Christianity and Dante and Barfield, and the second one is your most recent book is Dante's Divine Comedy, a guide for the spiritual journey. And I would very much like to bring those into the discussions because they had great influence on my thinking. So the immediate reason why we decided to talk is that Mark had recently made 10 points on AI, and I found them super interesting and relevant. And then our common friend Karen Wong also found it that it would be interesting if we talked, so she connected us. So my goal is to string the discussion on those 10 points, which I noted. But before, I want to put a bigger frame around this discussion, because you have an amazing skill set coming from psychology and theology and philosophy. And I think these are very relevant to the current discussion on AI. And it's not very well known, especially not in the tech community, why those skills are relevant. So my first question to you would be, how did you end up accumulating this amazing skill set? So what was your journey? How did they follow from each other?
I mean, it's just happenstance, really. I suppose if there were a common thread, I've always been interested in the big questions. And, so when I was younger and did the physics only at an undergraduate level, but did an undergraduate physics degree, it was always the bigger questions, cosmology or the quantum theoretical side, rather than, I don't know, solid state physics. That never particularly drew me. But then sort of moved on to theology. It might seem very different to many people, but again, it's still big questions. Cosmology is just called creation theology. So that would be a thread. And then I ended up doing a philosophy PhD, but again, it was about Plato, and Plato is also asking these big questions about who we are. And even now, working as a psychotherapist, it's typically working intimately with individual people, but it's still that sense of what's life about lies at some point behind psychotherapy. So yeah, I guess that would be a thread.
So it's almost like you started from very far and then you arrived towards psychology yourself or people, right? So I see a
Well,
little bit.
one thing
Yeah.
I took very much from Plato was that who you are is directly related to what you know. And so for the ancient philosophers, and actually I think for all philosophers up until fairly recently, maybe 150 years ago, working on yourself and developing your capacity to perceive the world, what you attend to, was very much part of the philosophical quest. It's only really since the rise of modern science, which I take to be really quite recent, that this ideal of objectivity, where you can almost extract out the person doing the science, has become very dominant. I think it's profoundly mistaken, because all science, as it were, comes through the human individual or a group of human individuals, and so asking ourselves who we are, how we're attending to the world, the ways that our way of life shapes what we do and don't perceive, must be fundamental, I think.
Yeah. Actually, it's not only a mistake from a, like, say, epistemological point of view, but I as a scientist found it really hard on myself, on my psychology, that I have to almost detach myself from the subject I'm studying, whereas of course I'm the most interested in that subject. So it leads, I call it lived dualism. Like, you have the scientific world that you study from outside in the lab, and then you go home and you live your life and you hug your kids, right? And
Well,
yeah.
well, you'll know that, even as an undergraduate, in a way, an undergraduate degree, you learn lots of things and you develop certain skills if you're lucky. With physics, it's a lot to do with mathematics, but also you're testing yourself. Could you become a physicist? And that's almost like an initiation rite. Can you enter this profession? Have you got the personality, or can you form your personality to fit in the world of physics? And I couldn't. I didn't. It wasn't. I was sort of finding the physics world wanting. It's just that I couldn't manage to do it. But in retrospect, I can see that becoming a scientist is to become a certain kind of person, and that is very much then shapes the scientific worldview. And so it's not the scientist is never actually neutral, even if that's the ideal or that's the story that's told. Becoming neutral means to extract certain parts of what it is to be human. And so, the fact that science is a reductive method for the most part is deeply connected to the reductive view of humanity
Yes.
that it has. And we're going to come to AI, but I think that's now playing out very substantially in the fears around AI, that one step back I think arise quite often from this denuded sense of humanity that is necessary to do science for the most part.
Yes, exactly. That's why I was to say that AI is becoming this like focal point where the scientist actually has to go out of from the lab, because AI was leaked out of the lab and now everybody knows about GPT, and somehow it became almost like this point around which these things is slowly changing, like with a lot of struggle, but I see a change of point of view among some of us who are in AI. I'm not saying it's a majority view,
Yeah.
but it's getting there.
Yeah, well, I wonder, conversations around AI very quickly get to speculations about the future, and
Exactly.
so that it's always a bit hostage to fortune, or we basically don't know what the future holds, and so it may not even really be a conversation worth having. But nonetheless, I think that there's two thoughts that came to my mind as you were talking there. One is that this reductive view of what it is to be human, and the reductive take on the world that science needs, is very powerful. It delivers a lot of technology, and so I think that must be part of its attraction, maybe the main reason for its attraction. But I think also I do wonder whether where AI doesn't progress along a sort of upward incline of progress, but actually I wonder whether it's really more asymptotic. And with ChatGPT, which is remarkable, and it suddenly appeared, it seemed. I don't doubt that, and to all intents and purposes, it's passed the Turing test. But nonetheless, I wonder whether this is another sort of ceiling with that approach to technology, and that ceiling's going to have to be broken in some way, rather than just ChatGPT 4 and ChatGPT 5 moving into some seamless future of general AI, which is often how the story's told. AI technology is often a bet on the future, and of course that brings investment, it brings wealth too. So it's very much in the interests of at least most people working in AI to tell this future story. But I'm very interested in those figures working in AI who aren't often the ones writing headlines. They're the people you meet sort of on the quiet. But you start to realize that this story of progress and inevitable power when it comes to AI is actually a lot more complicated. And you must know this very much better than I do.
Yeah, I think the wiser and older among us know this, that this is not the end of the story. The GPT was really surprising, but we need 2-3 more fundamental paradigm level breakthroughs to get near human AI, and that it can take a lot of time. It's not going to go exponentially. That's what I believe, and a lot of us. We can talk about it later, how like the emotions of people changed around GPT because of its surprise. But before that, I would like to dig into a little bit into the theology psychology angle, because I think that is also not obvious to people how they are related. If I go to therapy, it's usually like a secular framework, and it took me a while to figure out what I wanted from therapy. And it's not about understanding me and caressing me and giving me, of course it's about having a safe space where you trust your therapist. But what I really want from my therapist is to help me figure out who I want to become, which is not easy. There's a lot of self-lying there and a lot of layers that I bring in from my childhood, etc. And then once it's more or less clear, then help me to get there. And it's again not something where just understanding will help, right? And this is like a self-transformative way of being. And I think this is where maybe theology comes in, because the whole thing is becoming something where I change, right? And I change into something that I think is a better version of myself. But how do you see the relationship between psychology and theology?
Well, one way of picking it up, given what you just said there, would draw on developmental psychology. And my understanding of developmental psychology, as has been worked at by the founding figures, both in psychotherapy. Freud was an early advocate of developmental psychology, but figures like Piaget are better known now. But it's that we develop as people through a series of thresholds, and those thresholds are crisis moments when we don't actually know what the future holds, because we're still within the earlier domain. And so it's just not possible for us to know. It's beyond our conception, beyond our imagination, beyond our sense of ourselves. So an obvious example is a very young child, when it's born, at first, it's really the only being that it's conscious of. I don't think it's probably very self-conscious, but nonetheless conscious of. And so the parent, the mother, is sort of part of that almost unitive experience of being. And when things are going well, it's a very blissful state, I've no doubt, to be a very, very young child. But quite quickly, the young child has to face the reality that, for example, when it wants food doesn't always instantly appear, or when it feels uncomfortable because it soiled itself, that isn't instantly cleaned up, or when it feels a bit cold, it doesn't necessarily instantly get the warmth that it seeks. And that crisis, and if you've had children, that they're very substantial crises in the life of a young child. The crying seems to convey the sense that the world is falling apart, unless this need is quickly met. And it's partly a survival thing, I've no doubt about that. But psychologically, I think what's going on there is that the young child is facing a kind of crisis, and it can't contain its feelings because it doesn't know that there's a wider world that will in time respond, but it may just not respond instantly. But all being well, the child moves through that crisis and then realizes more and more clearly that there's a parent, there's a mother, there's another, and that really what's going on when it wants the food and so on is that there's a negotiation going on, a relationship is building up. And of course, that's a good thing, because now, rather than just the world being a bit one-dimensional, it becomes two-dimensional. There's now the child and the parent, and love can be exchanged more clearly and freely, and it's expansive, the world's grown. But that growth of love and relationship, and also the sense of what it is to be human, because now there's another person, it can only happen through the crisis, because the older, more unitive sense of self must break down. And I think you can build a picture of the development of what it is for us through a whole series of these crises, which involve breakdown. Hopefully a breakdown that doesn't destroy us, and that's always a risk. And a lot of mental health trouble is because there've been these kind of earlier breakdowns that weren't fully negotiated, and they revisit in later life. But I think that gives a sort of model for how sort of crisis, suffering, struggle, not knowing, these are part of our intelligence, and that without those kind of phases of struggle and suffering and not knowing and so on, our sense of the world remains very constrained, very limited. And so I think this is why psychology is deeply connected to intelligence. And so an artificial intelligence that doesn't have a psychology, I think, well, calling it an artificial intelligence really is a misnomer. I've heard people say that it's better to talk about machine learning or something like that. And that, that makes a lot of sense to me, actually. In the world of AI, our words quickly slip and slide, and we're saying things about a computer that, aren't really warranted, but the metaphors have just become a bit literal, like, intelligence. I think intelligence is a deeply felt notion that requires a history, and is very connected to what it is to be a person. And I think to bring in the theological element, it's not just our own inner psyches that we become more and more aware of, more and more intelligent about, all being well. But we know too that our minds start to fit the mind of the world around us. Our intelligence is not isolated. It's part of the intelligence that forms the world around us as well, which of course is why science can be done. And the great scientists have recognized this, Einstein being, probably the best known example. He very clearly saw himself and his own intelligence as being but a reflection of the intelligence that was in the cosmos. And, that's a very great realization. And again, it's a realization that comes from the struggle and from the sense of finitude. And so having reverence for the greater and maybe even infinitude of intelligence around us. This experience of being human in relation to the cosmos, which, is ultimately a theological experience, is deeply woven into intelligence. And, so it seems to me that when people talk about artificial intelligence, we just haven't really reflected enough on what actually forms our own intelligence. And when the minute we start to do that, and the minute we ask the question of, you know, how science is even possible and so on, the notion of intelligence, instead of having this rather reductive form, starts to become much more expansive once again.
Yeah, so I'm actually wondering, because when you're describing the child, the transformation the children go through, a lot of that is driven by biology, growing up actually physically. Like adolescence is driven from inside, and that's why it's sometimes so hard, because it feels like some force that you don't have control on pushing you through it. But once you become adult, at least in today's society, it's common okay. It's kind of okay to stay wherever you were in like your 20s, and transformation becomes optional. And so when you go through these steps, let's say actually that, you know, if I think about your book on Dante, when the people in the purgatory are at various adult transformational stages that they are struggling with, they are the ones in the purgatory who are not hopeless, so they still have the chance to actually go through the stages and get to paradise. And I feel that a lot of us are stuck at certain adult stages in this journey through life, and especially in AI, in tech, you know, because it's related also to what we were talking about science, that it actually forces you to be stuck at a certain level so you can detach yourself from the subject, because this is what you are taught as the you know, method should be. So there are all these forces that keep you there, and there are also the forces that keep you there that are just, I wouldn't call it laziness, but just it's easier to stay at a certain level and not go through these stages. So that's why I found the Dante book so interesting, because it's seemingly it's about theology, but no, not really. It's about your spiritual journey as a person who can stuck there really in hell, like in the really bad scenes, and you can be on the top of hell. So my favorite part was the top of hell, these little scenes, and the purgatory, because probably, I mean, I don't have a lot of experience with those really bad people, you know, who are on the bottom, but around me I see a lot of the people who are suffering at the top of hell in their life, and it's not about their future life, it's their current life, right? Or in purgatory, trying to go through the stages. So that's why I think it's, and to bring in your other book on Barfield and the Secret History of Christianity, I saw a beautiful parallel, because in that book you are looking at the growing up of humanity through history, and it was very much about what you're talking about, the child, where it's actually it's the waking up of humanity and the self-transformation of the human society, of everybody, right? That's what we go through in history.
Yeah,
So
so I must just sort of leap in there, if you don't mind, actually, because Owen Barfield is now sat on my shoulder. And he actually was very clear that whilst he felt we could tell a story about changing consciousness through periods of sort of centuries over the millennia in terms of human history. Maybe we should just say, you know, Owen Barfield, great friend of C.S. Lewis and J.R. Tolkien, one of the inklings. Both Tolkien and Lewis said that Barfield had the greatest ideas. And what they were all very interested in was words, and particularly how words change meaning. You know, it's why Tolkien, when he writes The Lord of the Rings, goes to all the trouble of inventing a whole language. And they realized that the experience of being alive is deeply connected to the language we speak. And what you can do, therefore, Barfield felt, was show how consciousness has changed over the centuries because of the way that words have changed meaning. So he called words fossils of consciousness. But he didn't actually think that it's like a move from being asleep to being awake. He felt that more it's just different forms, different changes, different kind of constellations of consciousness. And so now, whereas we have a consciousness that's very focused and based on the sense of being an individual, previously in different times and places, and maybe even now, there's a form of consciousness which is primarily based upon being a kind of collective, a shared consciousness. And so hence now we have crises of meaning that are based on the alienated or isolated self, something which is just impossible to imagine in previous periods of history. But the point is that those collective forms of consciousness, they have their own sophistication, they have their own awareness. If you read ancient myth, it's quite clear they're immensely subtle, as well as useful modes of intelligence, and making intelligence available, the cosmic intelligence available too, which is why they draw us, why they fascinate us. We sort of get this sense they hold something that maybe we now, with this very advanced form of individual consciousness, which brings great advantages, but we realize too what we're missing, or at least we're missing something. And so looking to other cultures, other forms of consciousness becomes really important. So just to that sort of corrective, Barfield called it the residue of unprocessed positivism, this idea that everything's got to progress on a kind of linear slope upwards. He thought that was the great myth of the modern world, so he was very sensitive to his work being read in the same way. He's not saying that, in fact. Christianity is hugely important, but he understood Christianity as seminal in the emergence of this stress on the individual and all the advantages that brings, but the disadvantages become very, very pronounced as well.
Yeah, I apologize for the word. So this is not actually the parallel I wanted to draw was between the baby who is born, who doesn't have an individuality in the beginning. He's or she's.
It's actually so again. Sometimes people do think that, as sometimes it's said, ontology and phylogeny are the same, so that the development of the individual is the same as the development of the culture.
Exactly.
But Barfield didn't think that was so. There's maybe some echoes, but he didn't really think that was so.
Okay, but what do you think about this? Because
it's a lot to do with it, with the reason why the evolution of language, the emergence of language, is such a conundrum in science, is that language is born fully developed. You can't have a language without fully developed grammar, without fully developed syntax, semantics, and so on. So the idea that grunts and squawks and whatever, combined with pointing and the need to survive or something, and gradually a language develops. The minute you look at that theory, it collapses. So there can't really be an incremental development of language. And figures like Barfield and some evolutionary thinkers now realize that language is a kind of rarefied receipt from the intelligence of the world around us, that then human beings use as a kind of tool, perhaps in part, but also as a way of relating and communicating to the wider ecology. So the sort of immature to mature notion, which clearly is the case for we human individuals, it doesn't really work, I think, when it comes to notions like consciousness and language.
I okay, I understand. Where I felt the parallel was like, I would assume that in ancient societies, babies who were born into a group of the Dunbar number, like 150 people, the leap between being attached to the mother and being her body to the adult world was much smoother, in the same way as when humanity. So it was a slow process. And today, because we have this notion of individuality, which is more like a higher, like a society notion, we get weaned off very fast from this very early stage, which causes a lot of psychological issues later. And the way I connect it to AI is that a lot of us in science, because of the things we talked about, are sort of like compensating for that lack of the shortness of that period where we were what you call the original participation. I see this in the individual development to the original participation where you were the same with your mother's body, and so that period is cut very short, and we are separated, and this is how maybe it's connected to that sort of notion within science that we have to separate from the subject that we're studying. So this, you mentioned that the world creates itself such that this is science, and the scientist is the person who is actually can live in that world. So the two things co-create each other, but maybe there is like a psychological root of this because of the too early separation.
I wonder. I mean, just sort of challenging a bit, if I may, what you're saying there. Because something is connected doesn't mean it doesn't have a very kind of sophisticated, advanced notion of connection. I think that if you look at ancient religious traditions of one sort or another, they'll be premised on the notion of connection, but they're in very complex and sophisticated forms of connectivity. Ancient religious systems with their libations and their rituals and their festivals and the sense of the gods in polytheistic systems, they're immensely sophisticated. They're all ways of negotiating that rich sense of being embedded in the cosmos. Whereas with a child, I think at least the evidence is that in the very early days, it's very, very simple. It's all unity. It's just driven by one or two needs, like to be fed, to feel comfortable. It's not complex at all. It becomes very complicated. I've no doubt about that. So the parallel, I think, doesn't really work myself. Original participation, which is Barfield's expression that you use. It's original, he means just because it's before our notion of participation. But I do actually think it's not right to think it was somehow simple and can be likened to a child's experience when it's first born.
Okay. So let's talk about the Dante book, because there were like 2-3 notions there where I felt it was relevant to the AI discussion. The first one was, it was super interesting to me when you say that in hell there's no novelty. Everything is just things that are rehashed. And I feel it's very much like the description of GPT. So
interesting. Yeah.
You remember this? So it's like it's a closed space there.
Yeah. No, you could say, I mean, I hadn't thought of that, but it's a nice analogy. And you could say that in hell, it's a closed data set. People are obsessed with their lives, and they're terrified about the future, but they're not able to bring anything new in. I mean, I've talked about it in the book because there's no present moment, and it's only in the present moment that things can change. There's no imagination, there's no intuition. Everything is sort of increasingly frozen. But I like that sense. You could say it's a data set where it sort of sucks all the information available to it and tries to, find a way of being in the world, but in a kind of closed cosmos where there's nothing new. And genuine novelty can only really come through the imagination, through inspiration, through intuition, because it's got to come from beyond us. And part of our task is to integrate that into our lives. But you're right. The infernal state is a bit like certainly a large language model anyway.
I love this analogy, and then when you go to paradise, there it's the opposite. Like it's almost like this ideal creative space where you can be in uncertainty without the fears that come with it.
Yeah, the sense of desire, for example, has changed. So it's not the desire based on lack. It's a desire based on the joy of knowing more and more. and so the finite soul in paradise is able to enjoy the movement through infinity, knowing that, as it were, wherever they turn, there's going to be something more beautiful to see. It's a bit like, I liken it, I think, to a piece of music. You know, when you know a piece of music, you want to get to know it better and better and better. And it's because you know the music will keep on giving more and more and more to you. You don't want to know it because you fear you might lose it, which is more the infernal kind of desire. Yeah. So that's what's genius about Dante, is that he very clearly, I think, in the infernal, the purgatorial, and then the paradisal states of mind, shows how they're different. And you mentioned, you know, how the early infernal states, you know, carry a lot of resonance now. In the very early stages, the first groups of people that Dante meets are figures that don't really know what life's about. You know, they're struggling. They're looking for leaders. They're looking for a kind of messiah, or alternative, they're looking for a kind of fear, because fear can give life shape and meaning. And you know, we live in a time that's full of fears, and they may be grounded to some degree. I'm not denying there aren't real things to fear, but nonetheless, I think the reason why they become so, they dominate the narrative, is because they seem to give a kind of negative form of meaning. You know, whereas in the purgatory, what's been learned is that fear actually contains the seeds of hope. And so whilst people in purgatory are suffering too, they know that this suffering is much more like the crises of developmental psychology, that if they can bear them, if they can hold them, stay with them, they're actually breakdowns that are leading to a breakthrough. And so in purgatory, there is the sense of expansion. It's not a closed data set, you know, like the infernal state of mind.
Yes. So there was actually one, like, even historically, it's very interesting to me that I think the minor sin of today that's probably the most dominant is addiction, because even technology is so, like, you know, it's optimized for addiction. And in Dante's book, the only point where it was mentioned, it was about gluttony. Like, the only thing you could have been addicted to was food at that time, and it was probably not a major problem, or not a lot of people were suffering from this, because we were like more down in the Maslow pyramid, right? We had to work hard just to maintain ourselves 700 years ago. And today, where the society is such that we have those basic needs met, we suddenly start to suffer at that very particular point about gluttony. And the reason why I'm bringing this in, because one of, you know, GPT is something that everybody knows, that it seems like the first big lab leak of AI, but it's actually not. First collision between society and AI is recommendation engines that are behind YouTube, all the social media. TikTok was actually built on it, on top of it. And those recommendation engines, while, you know, in the beginning, the idea was just to optimize the content that you will consume so you will be happy, it very rapidly became a tool to hijack the dopamine system, like computer games. So that's why, for me, the gluttony was one of the things that were that from the AI point of view took my attention, and I started to thinking about it in these terms. So what do you think about? Do you have any experience with this first encounter with AI?
I think, I mean, one of the, I suppose I often approach these things by thinking about the words that are used, taking a lead from Barfield. You know, words, we're inclined to treat them as if they're just signs that sort of identify something, but words contain their own wisdom. And for example, you know, when it comes to modern social media, the fact that there's been developed what's called an infinite scroll, you know, where you just keep flicking and so on. You know, the word infinite, until recent times, always had this theological overtone. There was the infinite domain of the eternal in the divine. And so the infinite was something that the finite soul had a yearning for, but a yearning that certainly in the mystical traditions would have been known to have been satisfied by seeing within your finitude a reflection of the infinitude of the divine. You know, so the human soul becomes a microcosm of the macrocosm of the soul. Or someone like the poet William Blake would talk about a world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wild flower, holding infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. That was the kind of consciousness that was being invited. And now, though, the infinite scroll is just a kind of more and more and more and more and more and more, but in a fragmented way, you know, just one thing after another that doesn't add up to anything, doesn't reveal more than itself, even in its fragment, like a grain of sand can reveal a world to William Blake. And so I think that, you know, that's part of the confusion that technology has brought. You know, in some ways, there's very noble aspirations behind technology, and this goes back to the early modern period. Someone like Francis Bacon, you know, who's so significant in terms of shaping the modern scientific mind. He thought that technology was being given to humanity by God in order to return us to the Garden of Eden, to relieve suffering. You know, that aspiration is still very operative in the you know, the desire to create technology alongside the desire to make money or whatever else goes on. No doubt about that. But it's profoundly mistaken, because it's got this collapsed view of what it is to be human. And so, you know, a finite sense or a mortal sense, a material sense of what it is to be human, can only view the infinite in terms of more and more and more and more. It can't view it in terms of seeing the one thing opening onto all things, because that vertical notion of the imagination just isn't available in a collapsed flat world. But nonetheless, the desire somehow to find satisfaction lives on, but in this very perverse form of the infinite scroll. That somehow, I sometimes when I'm flicking through social media now, I ask myself, you know, what am I hoping for with the next flick? You know, what's going on in that fragment of a moment when I look for, you know, in one way, it's just some distraction that, you know, I want to click on that and read what has happened to, you know, to flick up. But of course, when that becomes a way of life, the distraction only really gives momentary relief, if it gives any kind of relief at all. And so you start to realize actually you have to pull back from, yeah, maybe, you know, that's when it becomes a bit addictive, like you're suggesting, and it becomes the struggle to pull back from this false promise of infinity.
Yeah. But I mean, the technology behind is AI, which means that whoever designed the technology doesn't have to know anything about dopamine or you. It just has to be such that it's optimized for you to stay there. And then it self-optimizes itself to dose the dopamine in the exact right sequence, so you stay there, right? You mean, see? So I actually found one therapeutic use of this. That's sort of my story. About 3 years ago, in the beginning of COVID, I got really hooked on Facebook when they started to have these short videos. And, you know, before going to sleep, my frontal lobe was already sleeping, you know, so I didn't have any control. And it was almost like a dream state because of the lack of control. So it's some lower brain structure that actually shows where I'm going. And I ended up going towards cage fights, you know, this really violent fights between two guys, sometimes two women. I felt the adrenaline coming, you know, so I was actually embodying those things. And it was really bad, not for a long time. because when I woke up, my frontal lobe woke up and said, it's not possible, I'm doing this in the evenings. I have to do something about it. And I did two things. One was get rid of Facebook on my phone. So that's where their algorithm actually didn't work for me, because it was so optimal that my frontal lobe said, my other self said that no, it's over. But the other thing was that I brought this into therapy. The actual history of what I was watching it, because it's not arbitrary. You are doing it in a certain direction that's probably telling you something about yourself. And so the decision I made then is that I want to do this. I want to be in a fight. I want to learn self-defense. I was at 51, I went down in the dojo. I was the oldest one and the greenest one. And it has been like a transformative decision. I mean, it happened 2.5 years ago, and I'm immensely grateful that I did this, because it was, this is a subject of another discussion, but this was really it really like participatively transformed me. So there was also a lot of procedural learning, how to do this, how to do that. There was a lot of this perspective, like how to fall and how to feel. What do you feel when somebody throws you over their shoulder? And then but it also changed who I am. Like I stand differently because of this. And the whole thing started because of this, encounter with the AI. So when I'm thinking about it,
I see. I wonder whether there's a kind of theological interpretation of that, which is that what
exactly.
you did was you moved from this sort of flatland, accumulative, disembodied experience of, in this case, the cage fighting, into a world where it was you participating, but also you were, although you were learning the techniques and so on, as you say, you were also drawing on a whole rich spiritual worldview, which is part and parcel of martial arts. And so I think when you maybe you might say, I mean, you tell me whether this feels right, but when you changed as a person, I imagine that was partly because you realized there was a whole other way of conceiving what it is to be a person that you could change into. A world didn't just sort of, as it were, open up to you, but presented itself to you that you could then step into through the practice. And so, that in that transformation you described there is the kind of lie of the narrow world of the purely technological. But it also, though, was a portal that you could step through to discover the much broader and richer sense of what it is to be human.
Yes, exactly. And the inkling was there from this addictive technology. So it did. So this is an example I tell to people when they just trying to thresh technology, that when you encounter something like that, there is always something in there which you can use for good. And if it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger, kind of thing, So this is one of the experience that makes me optimistic, actually, that whatever technology we let throw at us, if it doesn't kill us, it can lead to something better, but not through the actual objective of the technology. It has to come from somewhere else.
Well, to refer back to William Blake's phrase about finding a world in a grain of sand, in a way you might say that technology at first pass, it gives you one grain of sand, then another grain of sand, then another grain of sand, and another grain of sand. But after a while, you start to realize that's not very satisfying. But just one grain of sand itself can open up a whole world. And so your energy or your attention, instead of being fixated on the accumulation, the kind of infinite scroll, starts to be very interested in how the infinite might be contained in the one thing. And so there's a way you stop scrolling and enter that world.
Yeah, beautiful. So let's talk about the AI, the 10 points. So I have my notes, and we don't have to go through those 10 points. It's just, it gives a sort of like a story. I liked it very much. It was very concise. It was maybe 20 minutes. And so you started saying that we have passed the Turing test and that it's not a good test. And I found it very interesting because actually John Vervaeke has another kind of test. He calls it or I called it maybe the dialogue test, where so the Turing test is basically where you talk to an AI and you cannot say it's not a human, right? That's when it passes they can differentiate between a human and an AI just by this conversational interface. And so John said that no, what you have to do is take two AIs and let them talk to each other. And that was at GPT-3 when he said this, that they go batshit crazy really fast. And I tried it, and they did go very fast towards it's really like the Dante's hell. It's like they go to one sentence and they just thanking each other and repeating the same thing over and over. So that was a complete disaster. Then I did this for GPT-4, and it was much better. It started so one question was, it started to talk about photography with itself and just bringing up different types of photography. After a while, it was obvious it wasn't human, because human imagination goes like all different directions. And the other one was about more philosophical subject, I don't remember, but what's happened there, that it was starting to summarize the discussion, both of them, just summarize with different words. So that was a much more sophisticated hell. Like, it was still not bringing in any novelty, just rehashing the same thing with different words. So it made a big leap between GPT-3 and GPT-4, but it was still very obvious that it was not two humans talking. So I don't know. So because you said in that video that the GPT passed the Turing test, and we have to live with it now, and that it's okay because it's not a good test, right? That was your first point.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I was using the phrase Turing test in the way that it's used more journalistically. That a human can have a conversation with ChatGPT-3. I mean, I think it does get a bit dreary quite quickly, actually. But nonetheless, the thing that really drew me, though, was actually Turing himself. Who in the paper where he proposes this test himself says it's not a very good test. And it often seems to get forgotten. But the reasons why Turing said it's not a very good test really interests me. The standout reason is because Alan Turing himself, believes that part of our intelligence, part of our communication, is, well, he called it telepathy, that we receive information and we engage with the wider world through certainly non-verbal means, and telepathy really, means the receipt of a feeling at a distance, telepathos, and that informs our intelligence quite as much as the pure exchange of data or information. So he thought that actually a better test would screen out, have to sort of have a control for that receipt of information. Well, it's not really information, it's sort of feeling, intuition, imagination, inspiration, that primarily comes not from the tidy exchange of information like words, but through a sort of feeling, a felt engagement. I mean, in the world of psychotherapy, this is all standard. It's called the transference, the countertransference, and we know from daily experience that it informs and it's very useful, but it's not a straightforward data. It's not discrete, it's not definable. You have to follow it, you have to discern it, you have to interpret it, you have to co-create with it. I think it's very fascinating that 50 years ago, Turing was alert to that. And so has already said how intelligence is much more involved than purely the exchange of the data type information. And so whilst he proposes this Turing test in the same paper, he says, look, sort of don't take it too seriously. This is just this is almost a paper that defines how a computer, so far as we know, and I think as Turing know, won't actually replicate human intelligence, as it was providing a sort of a way of assessing whether a computer has replicated human intelligence.
Yeah, and I think in the dialogue test this comes out, because you don't have those inspirations or those telepathic transferences between two GPTs, obviously, right? So it becomes very fast clear that there is no imagination going on there, right?
Mm-hmm.
So your second point was it's quite prosaic but true, that the motivation for AI leaders is to oversell AI, which is always the case for technology because their sort of livelihood depends on it, right?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, we've got to the moment now where there's a number of AI leaders that are sort of wishing they didn't oversell AI. I mean, in the UK, Mustafa Seliman, who's the head of DeepMind, has recently got a lot of attention because of a book he's written, and he's very worried and thinks that we should legislate and so on. And that, well, nuclear technology, I suppose, in terms of energy provision, was heavily legislated and so didn't develop in the way that it was originally imagined in the 1950s and the 60s. That there were like the president of the US, Nixon, had the sense that there would be thousands of nuclear power plants spread around the US really rather quickly, and he hoped that it would then mean that the US wasn't reliant on oil, and so politically wasn't so tied to the Middle East and so on. That was a kind of early vision, and that didn't happen. That hasn't happened because of legislation. So technology can be limited by legislation. There's a lot of pressure points that a government can exert on technology. We talk about AI as if it doesn't have a material substrate, but it requires a lot of power. It requires a lot of human ingenuity. It requires chips. So they have to be manufactured. There's a kind of industry behind it all, and so on. And governments can hinder that or prevent it if they want. But nonetheless, yeah, I think that talking up the future, usually in terms of what it's going to deliver positively for humankind, that's just part and parcel of science. Science is it delivers things for now, and there's no doubt about it, but it's a constant bet that it's going to deliver more for now as well. Mm-hmm. And so it's very standard in science journalism for the story where the science hasn't shown what was thought. The call is, but we need more science. But when the story is the science has shown what we thought, the call is still we need more science because we'll know more. So it's a very heads I win, tails you lose kind of environment. The whole scientific enterprise, it's our myth of progress. That's how we think things will advance, is through science. And so AI is it's maybe a bit more intense because of venture capital and so on, but nonetheless is replicating that.
Mm-hmm. The third point was very interesting. It was about feelings, and you actually asked us to think about what are the desires, what are the hopes, and what are the despair that is played out in this story, if we can call it that. And I found it very interesting because it's that's a more profound question than Turing test or GPT. Is what is the kind of world we are creating, and how is it related to our deepest feelings, which is usually not discussed in tech discussions.
No, I've read that a lot of tech is driven by quite narrow competitive impulses. You know, apparently in Silicon Valley, there's an obsession with what the Chinese are doing and staying ahead of the Chinese. That's really a lot of the impulse. Or, you know, the race between, even, you know, in a company like DeepMind, which is based here in London, they, in the foyer, you can see it, they have, you know, what one AI achieved overnight versus what another AI achieved overnight. So there's even internal competition. You know, the whole industry is, you know, in quite significant measure driven by that. So I understand.
Yeah, there's a lot of fear and anger too.
No reference really to what it is to be human and what we really might desire and so on. I mean, a number of the books on AI, that's where I've got this from too. You know, that there'll be writers, even if they write about the concerns they have, and they make proposed rules or laws or whatever that they feel are needed, there will always be a moment where they ask this question, though, but we also need to ask ourselves what it is to be human. What do we want? And they have almost nothing to say about that, which isn't surprising because, you know, as we began, to get to that position in the AI world, you have to have collapsed your sense of what it is to be human. You know, that's what it is to be an AI expert. And so, you know, they're not the people to ask this question.
So point number 4 is that he pointed out that the goal of science is to propose models, and AI is one model of cognition. But then the model gets confused with reality, and that's another collapse. We can talk about it in this way. So
yes, I mean the parallel I was thinking of recently was I did this physics, you know, degree, and my tutor is actually quite a well-known cosmologist, and what he does is he builds models of the cosmos on a computer, supercomputer, runs the model, and then compares the results from the model with what's observed of the universe itself. But he never thinks he's building universes in a supercomputer. You know, he knows it's a model, but you wouldn't make that slippage. But I think because we've got so used to describing ourselves as information processing machines, you know, the brain is just routinely likened to a data center. We forget that the model is not reality. It's just a model. And yeah, so that gets lost in the world of AI.
So I would push back on this a little bit, because in my mind, AI is not a science in the classical notion where science is about knowing more or discovering the truth. It's more engineering. Again, it's not to denigrate it, but just like in sort of paradigmatic sense. It's about creating something. So engineers, the goal of engineering is not to discover the truth, but based on what truths we discovered, create stuff, create things that become part of reality. So in that sense, for me, AI is not a scientific product, but an engineering product that was based on some scientific discoveries or, you know, computer science. On the other hand, I would agree with you that it's not modeling, it is not cognition, or it's not the real intelligence, but it's more because the underlying metaphysics of the engineering paradigm is that minds are machines. See what I mean? So we are creating machine-like minds.
Yeah. I mean, so yeah, so I guess that I'd have to reframe my point, which is that the human mind is being described using machine metaphors, and so then the engineering feels like it can build the equivalent of human mind. Yeah, there's that kind of intermediate step that's necessary. You know, it ever was thus. Whatever is the advanced technology of the time is used to supply metaphors to describe the human mind. Freud, he lived in the age of the steam engine. He's full of steam engine analogies to describe. We still have them. You know, we talk about catharsis, a sort of release of pressure. You know, where does that come from? It comes from a steam engine.
I didn't know that.
You know, it maybe is useful somewhat, but we also realize now, because we're not so caught up in metaphors of the steam engine, that it's limited. And I think so. I guess that as the engineering advances, so the metaphors change.
And the engineers actually create the metaphors, right?
Yeah,
they realize the metaphors in certain sense.
Yeah, if a metaphor is using something that is literal in one world to describe something in another world. And in a world of technological advance and where the whole economy is organized around the production of technology, surprise, surprise, we use our metaphors from the world of engineering. But I guess maybe to put it more neatly now, I'm thinking a bit, we don't confuse models with reality, so we shouldn't confuse metaphors with reality.
Exactly.
Metaphors help open up reality to us, but they're not reality itself.
But the funny thing is that the engineer actually realizes the metaphor somehow. So the metaphor becomes creative.
Engineering and then is applied in other areas. Wouldn't that be so?
Say it again.
The engineering supplies the metaphor.
That's for sure true, but I was actually thinking that it goes in the other way around, that the metaphor becomes reality somehow. Like the mind is a machine. It's not necessarily an engineering. It's more philosophy. But then the engineer takes that metaphor and makes a machine that looks like the mind, something like that. And then we believe the metaphor. So it actually realizes it. Yeah.
We certainly believe the metaphor. Yeah, I think that's right. We certainly believe the metaphor. I mean, just incidentally, though, this idea about minds being machines and so on, and the mechanical philosophy, as Francis Bacon called it, it's very paradoxical, because in other areas of science, like in fundamental physics, it's now quite easy to find physicists that are saying the machine metaphor doesn't work when it comes to reality. And there's a growing part of modern physics that is talking about reality being much more like an organism, and that machine interactions are just a tiny, rather specialist fragmentation of that much broader notion of interaction. I mean, you get this a bit in information science now. It's much more.
Yeah, and actually,
the metaphors that are being used.
The organism metaphor is very interesting, because there are some people like Michael Levin who start to use the organism metaphor for engineering and say that once we have AI everywhere, these kind of adaptive algorithms, we will have to think about the totality of them as organisms, that rather than controllable machines. And so control becomes persuasion, like what we do with minded creatures. We cannot control them totally. We can try to persuade them to do something, and that's how a lot of biological organizations work. It's very interesting if this metaphor takes off, because it will redefine what engineering is. So I'm very much living it in my research, actually.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. So but then you have to watch the direction of travel. So the need for a different metaphor to describe reality, because the old metaphor has stopped working. The machine metaphor in this case has stopped working. So you look to organism or organismic metaphors, if that's the word. But reality, as it were, is the ultimate arbiter of these things, you might say. Not what the engineer's building. What the engineer is building may be very, very useful and complicated and sophisticated and so on, but
they become part of reality. So it goes back and forth, because we create reality, right? But yeah, it's
well, I think I would say we co-create. We participate in reality and can amplify it and dwell in certain parts of reality and so on, by the worlds we build, the cities we live in, what we read, the art we make, and so on. But ultimately, I think that we're discovering more of reality rather than making reality. That would be a way of putting it.
Or both, actually. So your fifth and sixth points are about this. In the fifth point, you say that we don't compute, we dwell in presence. And we don't rush through our memories to seek something like the computers do. It's more like they pop up for some reason. And I was wondering, it reminded very much to the 4P of John Vervaeke. So it's like it has a taste of a first-person view versus a third-person view. What you're saying there, like we are participating in reality, not just observing it and reacting to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this is part. So this would be drawing on another set of metaphors, which would be the field metaphors. Which again are very influential in science, in electromagnetic science particularly, and even now I think in some areas of biology, where in systems biology, where it's realized that, as it were, every level of the organism has to be factored in somehow, and that gets very complicated very quickly. There's a combination and explosion, as it's sometimes said, if you try and approach it through a computational method. So bringing in field metaphors becomes another way of approaching it. But I'm also very influenced by the discussion about memory and how memory works. Again, another great conundrum in science. And I suspect it's because memory is not stored in our brain. We haven't got data centers in our skulls, but actually that the brain is some kind of organ for interacting with the wider world around us, and that memory too is in that wider world, much like physical objects are in that wider world. And that's why, we have these experiences that you turn a corner and suddenly remember what you were thinking when you last turned that corner. And it's why, we don't have memory recall, like a computer diving into a sort of chip, looking for the relevant bit of data that's been filed away correctly, but that we muse and we somehow go into our bodies, and a much better way to remember things is actually to have a sort of open mind rather than trying to go through everything that's in your mind. Now, this is more controversial, the idea that memory is not stored in the brain. That would certainly not be the standard hypothesis. But the standard hypothesis is really struggling, I think. And so there are a few, people who work in memory and are trying to look to different metaphors to understand memory, and field metaphors is one of them.
Yeah, and perhaps one not so controversial thing to say is that like our propositional memory, like semantic memory, has been outsourced for a long time, since even like speech is somehow like that, but when since writing, for sure, we started to put it on things that store the memory, and then our brain is just an interface to them to trigger those memories.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly so. We've used technologies to help our memory, but I'm in a way I'm suggesting something a bit more radical, which is that our memories are embedded in the world in which we live, not just devised, not just put into the world in which we live through the technologies that we might develop, like writing. It seems to me to follow from this, if you accept that intelligence is actually part of the cosmic reality, and that our intelligence is just a reflection or a fragment of that, which is why science works. It seems to me that that's what Einstein was saying, that he realized that he could use his imagination and his mathematical abilities to sort of produce a kind of condensed version of one part of the cosmic intelligence. So too our memories are like that. That this is standard in Plato. Plato says that memory is really recollection, it's remembrance, and so the person with a good memory isn't actually someone that can just stack up a list of things in their mind, but is someone who is open through the person that they are to the world around them, and so is visionary, for example. And that's because they're remembering, they're able to recollect that which is around them and put it into a particular form, no doubt about that, that suits a certain time and place or uses a certain kind of technique like mathematics.
No,
But the
absolutely.
wellspring, the source, is breathed into us, is
No,
inspired.
absolutely. I absolutely agree with you. Just I thought that it would be easier for someone who gets this thought first time to understand that it's already started with the semantic memory, but then you have the procedural memory, how to do things that are obviously related to the objects we surround ourselves with and use tools basically, and then episodic memory. So these are the four things in Vervaake's system: semantic, procedural, episodic, and the self. And you are very much talking about the top two ones, the participatory and the perspectival levels, where basically what you're saying, if I understand correctly, is that your self and your perspectival, so episodic memory, things that happened with you, are not in your brain, but they are also outsourced. And it's a very interesting thought, because it means that we are connected, right?
I mean, you may be saying this actually already, but even procedural memory, like driving a car, for example, when you have to remember the procedure, you're not very good at it. But when you can get in the flow of all the traffic and everything that's going on around you, so a good car driver actually is much more able to receive from the world around them than they are just know what they need to do next. And if they have to concentrate too much on what they need to do next, they're not a very good driver.
Sport and musicians, that's very well known. Like musician just sits down and plays the And sometimes you have to start it from the beginning because you cannot start in the middle. It's very interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so point number 6 was that technology is unadaptive. So it reminds me to the Dante's hell, actually. And that the world we live in, is already adapted to technology. So technology is not taking over reality, but reality is built in a such way that technology fits in. And it's reminded very
our
much,
reality, the reality that shapes the modern world, which I think is a kind of a very particular take on reality.
I mean, it reminded me to Jan Magyar Christ's two-hemisphere world, where how the left hemisphere takes over and actually built a world in which it feels good, right? And so it dominates, and our internal world, scientific, dualism, and outer world, these squared cities and nature left out, and technology, and how these two things, co-create each other. It was very interesting.
Yeah. And again, I think that it's important to remember that the dream of like the perfect thinking machine is an ancient dream. And you can feel it, you can see how it existed in various parts of the world in history, but it particularly becomes the way that the modern world starts to shape itself, again, with figures like Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon dreams of the perfect thinking machine, and he feels that it would be better than a human thought, because for Francis Bacon, it wouldn't be distracted by emotion and feeling and so on. I mean, I think that's mistaken myself, as we've been saying earlier, but nonetheless, this is the kind of dream. But Francis Bacon wasn't able to build that machine because he only had wood and water and things like that available to him. He didn't have silicon chips, so just practically it wasn't possible. But that starts the effort to build a modern world that is making itself ready for the so-called perfect thinking machine. And and for plenty of people now with very powerful silicon chips, it feels like maybe the perfect thinking machine can now actually be built. But the reason why it feels so compelling is because we've been dreaming and bringing that world into reality for so long, and have forgotten other parts of reality in the process.
So then you said that attention is a moral act, and that panic, and that's very interesting, I will explain why. So panic makes attention more and more focused. So that's true. When we are in a fear, our attention gets very narrow onto the object of the fear, like the lion or whoever is attacking us. And so we should try to understand where our fears come from and learn to step out and look at our fears and then widen our attention. So it's almost like a cookbook recipe of how to not to push down, but how to manage your fears. And I think this is very important, because what's happened historically is that GPT did not just surprise the big public. GPT surprised a lot of researchers that were saying like 3 years ago that this is not possible, including me actually. I didn't think that this very simple paradigm of just trying to predict the next word on whatever corpus and whatever algorithm, that this paradigm will lead to algorithms like GPT that are so good at conversing with us and giving us plans and giving us information. And a lot of people, so there was this psychological effect where it wasn't only about their scientific standing, like I predicted something and it wasn't true, but the fact that their predictions were wrong made their world collapse, right? So they had to deal with also this problem of, okay, maybe I'm not that good at predicting things. And then fear. So if I'm not that good at predicting things, maybe the worst will come, because that's a very good assumption if you're in a forest and you really don't know what's going on around. Try to hide, yeah, right? So then there was this in my mind, this is what started this movement of putting brakes on AI and trying to stop or trying to slow it down, which is actually maybe not a very bad policy, but this is the way I see the like the psychological roots of this. And when you say fear makes us narrow and we should understand our fears, this is what it reminded me to.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. Certainly, the way to live with fear is to give yourself the space to start to know more than just the fear. And so I think that this moment around AI is a moment to ask again, but what is intelligence? And not just be caught up with, Terminator-like fears that, it's about to wake up, or at least it's about to, develop general notions of intelligence, so it can set its own agenda and so on. That's just feeding the fear. But to ask ourselves now, what is intelligence? We can do that now. We can do that. It's rather been forgotten, but there's plenty of good understandings of what intelligence is, and that I fear would. I mean, who knows? We're talking about world movements here, so who knows what's going to happen? And bad things do happen. Tragedies do occur. There's no doubt about that. But it seems to me to be important to ask this question, which we can ask and answer in some quite substantial measure. What is intelligence again? And not just let it be led by people that have a very narrow view of intelligence.
Actually, that was your next point, is that technology can ease suffering. It can help us to connect with others, and that love of life is part of intelligence, which was a very interesting statement. And what you love is what you attend to. So it's
I mean, well, this comes from Dante, but not only Dante, but that the intellect and love are deeply connected, and in at least two ways. One is because the intellect is intentionally driven. To develop your intellect, you need to look at something, to try and understand something, and there's always that movement towards something. And what you move towards, it may be what you fear, but it, hopefully more commonly, it's what you love, what you long for. And so the intellect is always, as it were, behind love. that was the initial movement towards what the intellect then wants to understand. And actually, I think you can even say that the intellect then maybe gets some knowledge of what's loved, but in doing that, it always has to make what's loved into its own forms of understanding. And so in some ways, if it was just the intellect, it's always going to reduce and sort of lose what's loved in the same moment. So there's the sense that love can actually reach further than the intellect. Again, you know, this is a rather abstract way of putting something that's actually an everyday experience. You know, if you try and describe your beloved, you know, it perhaps does a good job in the sense it captures some of their characteristics, some of their qualities and so on. But if you feel you've summarized the whole of them in your description, you're going to lose them.
And they hate it.
or similarly, it's why poetry is a form of intelligence. You know, a great poem understands that words are better when they're regarded as sort of pointers or indicative, or they conjure a sense of something. But what the words can't express, the edge of words, which of course Dante knows about very, very well, that silence around the words is really where the awareness, the participation occurs. And so, you know, love both guides the intellect, but also is always ahead of the intellect, maybe refined and discerned through the intellect, and so on. But yeah, I think that's why intelligence is deeply connected to love.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And so your last point is to say to have patience, embrace the boredom, dwell in uncertainty, convert suffering to hope, and think about our own psychology. These are my notes, actually. So.
Right, yeah. Well, I mean, this maybe the way takes us back to where we began, if we're drawing to a close now, because this is the purgatorial state.
Yeah.
You know, where there is suffering, but there's hope, where there is time, but the time is the present moment now, unlike the inferno. So the present moment is the only moment where there can be change, but there's also the awareness that change takes time, and so there's the need for patience. And so, yeah, what you just summarized there in a way is the move from the infernal, closed, locked, limited data set state of mind to the purgatorial one, which is still hard, but it genuinely knows it's going somewhere, not in a sort of progressive sense, but in an expansive sense.
Okay, so these were your 10 points, and it's a beautiful way to close this. I have only one question about this, is that where do you think this is going, and what would you advise to me? What would be your advice to me as a researcher in AI, like what to do?
Look, I don't know that I could suggest anything. I imagine that you have much better a sense of that yourself, both where it might go, but also, you know, what to do. I mean, my plea in a way is for not so much an expanded sense of intelligence, but a true sense of intelligence, just by reflecting on what our intelligence actually is. You know, if we want to grow in that of which we already are, and rather than just build you know, models that no doubt have a certain kind of power, and I've no doubt will bring change, don't get me wrong in all this, I'm not saying this isn't very significant, but can that significance be a prompt to become more aware of our own significance once more? And, you know, so bring back meaning and so on. Even, you know, the word crisis has this old sense that the crisis point in an illness was when things were going to turn, and they can turn for the worse, but they can also turn for the better. And so I suppose, you know, whether you feel, maybe this is my question to you, do you feel that this crisis moment can be a turn for the better, rather than this panic-driven fear of what's going to happen?
I'm personally very optimistic, but I don't know where it comes from. It's mysterious because people with the same background and same upbringing can be very pessimistic. I very much enjoy my work, which right now actually, with GPT it's actually narrowed the scope because everybody somehow jumped on language models, and AI was much broader than that, and it's still much broader. So I'm not much into that direction. I also think that sort of language model thing is limited. We fed most of what has been written by humanity ever into these machines, so there is not much more data. There can be some improvement on the algorithmic side and on the size of the models, but it also opens up several other directions. There is a lot of talk about putting it reminds me to what you were saying, because putting episodic memory into these language models, because these language models don't remember what happens with them between you and the language model. They have a very shorter memory, but they don't remember. They are not your personal assistant. They don't remember what you did with them or what you converse with them 10 days ago. And there are some technological and business problems why we don't do that now. Why don't you have your own personal language model? So there is definitely some opening there to make them more personalized, but in terms of like containing more information, it's not possible because there's no more information. Everything is there that was written. There is some direction into multimodality, so models that can also look at pictures and video. But in terms of our discussion, I think like metaphysically they are limited because they don't have a body. So what I'm interested in the most is embodying these things. And if you don't even have to think about complicated robots, like just put AI in a little device like your Wi-Fi antenna that you can communicate with it. It can learn your habits and adapt to them. And that goes into this direction of Michael Levin's paradigm change to think about these systems as organisms more than just machines, because once your Wi-Fi learns your habits, it adapts to you, it will have an individuated model about the world. It will be your world. So if you swap your Wi-Fi antenna with your neighbor, they will not work. You buy a new one, the old antenna will have to teach the new one about what it knows. And these are more like biological analogies than engineering analogies, because we used to just download the old one to the new, but it might not be possible. So
yeah, I've heard people. Is this connected to what you're saying? I've heard AI people say that they think the future is much more going to be cybernetics.
So
rather than
actually,
modeling.
I didn't understand that what you meant by this. This was one of your points that I didn't mention. So what do you mean by that?
So as I understand it, cybernetics is the way that technology is always integrated with particularly with the human body, but maybe with other bodies as well. So rather than building models and as it were then operating within the closed cosmos of the model itself, there's this constant exchange of information, from the person to the technology. And so someone who has a cybernetic arm, a false arm, it wouldn't work if the computer in the false arm had to constantly build a model of the world in which the arm was, because you get again this sort of combinatory explosion. But instead, there's the interface between the human intention, the mechanical arm, and then the world itself. And so you have that sort of cybernetic flow.
Yes, I agree with that. That it's a really good direction, and it also matches what John Vervaeke is asking for. That we when, you know, there's this big word in AI called alignment. Like we want AI which is aligned to our values. And at this time, it's very much about, like, I would call it propositional alignment. We try to define rules to make them behave as we want, or let's say procedural alignment, which is what you do with your dog in a very simple model, like to dress it. You know, when it's a bad dog, you punish it. When it's a good dog, you give a cookie. And so this is how language models are trained in today. It's called reinforcement learning with human feedback, and it's very much like giving thumbs up and thumbs down on their answers, so they behave well. But the thing is that, so what John is advocating is that to reach to perspectival and participatory level, AI will have to be embodied, and these embodied things or beings will have to be brought up as we do with kids. So alignment will be embodied, procedural, perspectival, participatory. These things will have to learn to take care of themselves and learn to bind to us and to reality the way we do, or the way a child does. And I like very much this program. It's very far from being majority. Most of the people in AI don't even know this. And there is also a pushback against this from the angle of, okay, so if we don't know how the AI behaves, we have this fear, it's uncertainty. One way to make sure they don't do damage is to not give them agency. So that's one of the points where we could stop AI actually doing something. But this ship has sailed, sort of like, you know, these AIs already have agency in terms of like going on the internet and do stuff, and they also have a lot of agency through us, which is a complicated one. So they act through us. They change what we think, like the social media AI. And so there is this, they already have agency on reality through us. But to do so this is already there, and I agree with John is that if we put them into things, we have a better way to sort of, it's more explicit. Their agency is more explicit if it's a little robot that works in your kitchen, or the Wi-Fi antenna that deals with your connections. And so we have more chance actually to do the job of bringing them up. So that would be my program. And technologically, it's a lot of challenge. So to GPT and most of the deep learning AI on images or text, they work very well because they have immense amount of data. Whereas these little things will have to learn on very small data, like we do, you know. So in a certain sense, maybe like scientifically, it's more interesting also because the algorithms we have to discover or invent, they will probably better models of us who learn on very small data than those algorithms that work on like the full internet. So these are my thoughts on where is this going. I'm personally not that much afraid of the AI Armageddon. I think it's blown up, and we'll deal with it when, you know, one crisis after another, but we'll deal with it when it happens. It's this, you know, this notion of exponential takeoff seems a very it's a certain theology actually. And so
I also want to see when we talk about agency, even there, you know, any sophisticated form of agency paradoxically is less and less independent agency. It becomes more and more dependent agency. You know, so you might say the great artist who creates a new form in one moment it looks like they have tremendous agency because they've created this whole new visual language, say. But of course, for the artist, they're constantly engaging with the world around them. They're deeply embedded in an artistic tradition. They're experimenting. They're utterly dependent upon the world around them in order to exercise this agency. And I just wonder whether, again, as we get more sophisticated about notions like agency and so on, where the sense of interaction and dependence, notions like autonomy and so on, they start to become much more porous, actually. Again, this is a sort of spiritual paradox that the greatest freedom is actually that which is most fully participating with the world around. And so, you know, in religious language, you have these seemingly paradoxical statements like service is perfect freedom. And you know, I sort of trust, I suppose, those spiritual or theological intuitions, and that so the idea that you know, intelligence and independent agency can kind of advance hand in hand, I don't think it really works like that. The greatest intelligence is actually, in a way, the intelligence which is more and more in service of the wider intelligence. Mm-hmm. And so its agency is how you know, the great scientists, they give themselves to their work, and so although they're fully participating and feel, you know, fulfilled and satisfied, in a way they lose themselves more and more in their work as well, and so their agency in an autonomous, independent sense goes down, actually.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Actually, I have a metaphor. I call it the high-functioning zombie, which is what's behind these AIs that are not connected to the world the way you describe it. They are very intelligent. So a zombie is disconnected from reality. It has a very narrow goal, and it doesn't bind either to reality other than the food it has to eat, so very narrowly, and it doesn't bind to other zombies either, or any other living being. And its body is also, its cells are not binding to each other either, right? It's falling apart. And so the high functioning zombie for me is the zombie that hides its zombiness. And this is very much a myth, like a modern myth, that describes the society, and it got ingrained into these projections of what AI will become. The AI, so we are afraid of AI becoming a high-functioning zombie, pursuing a narrow goal, but being very intelligent and very good at that goal while not binding to reality. So it's sort of like this artist that is at the same time very intelligent but disconnected from reality, which doesn't exist. So evolution takes care of this, right? Because you cannot live like this, but somehow in the imagination of people who may be disconnected, they can imagine a technology becoming that. And it's not something we can actually exclude. We don't really have an example for this, but I'm not saying I'm 100% sure that this would not happen. But somehow being afraid of this is what it creates it. You know, it's the classical Greek myth. Mm-hmm. Like it's a prophecy. The reason I don't like it, it's not because I don't validate people who think this, and I don't validate their fears. It's because I think it's a prophecy that self creates itself. If our real goal is to work against it, it will create itself. So I prefer like a positive picture and going towards a positive picture than a negative picture and go pushing it, trying to push it against.
The future will tell us if we're still around to even know.
Yeah. In the meantime, I just, you know, wish everybody worked on themselves like the old philosophers and scientists to understand their own fears. Sure. Well, thank you very much, Mark. It was great. It was a little bit longer than we planned.
Thank you for inviting me on and for your interest. And and what you said, because this is good to work out in conversations. So yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I think these conversations are very, very important. I'm trying to push my colleagues also to engage in such conversations. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Well, look, cheers.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.